Today I'm going to show you how I drew this Honu, which is the Hawaiian word for green sea turtle, and I did this in colored pencil. For bonus real-time clips of me working on this piece, please watch until the end. You will be able to see in better detail how I work on the scales and neck wrinkles of the Honu, as well as part of the coral. For the materials, I used mainly Prismacolor colored pencils, but some Faber-Castell polychromos pencils for finer details. The paper is Strathmore Bristol Smooth paper, 300 series, 100 pounds. And this is important to use a good, thick, artist quality paper because with colored pencils, you're burnishing a lot and using many layers of color and also solvent that will damage or warp thinner or lower quality paper. For the full list of materials used, please see the description box below. Okay, so with all that info out of the way, let's get on with the tutorial. So going back a little, I started off with the eyes of the Honu. With eyes, I try to use an indigo or dark blue and mix it with a dark brown to get varying tones of black. And this way parts of the eyes won't look so flat. And with colored pencil, you always want to mix a lot of different colors to get the different shades and tones to achieve a more three-dimensional and realistic look. So even if something appears to be a certain color, take a closer look at your reference photo and you'll see there are many different colors at play in there. Next, I go over parts around the eyes and the scales and the mouth. When working on different parts of the Honu, you always need to consider a few things. What colors make up this section that I'm working on? What textures am I trying to replicate? For colors, you again want to look at your reference photo and pull several matching colors to mix. Use a scratch piece of paper as your palette to see if the colors work well. Then also consider the texture. What kind of strokes you need to make and how hard you need to press the pencil down to create the different textures. For example, here I am working on the mouth and neck of the Honu. There are whites, cream colors, yellows, oranges, browns, grays, and even blues on the reference photo. Because this is the light part of the Honu, I can't press too hard on the darker colors or it will look too dark and I won't be able to fix these parts as easily. I go over how to draw the wrinkles under the neck in better detail in the bonus real-time clip in the end. I start by lightly shading the Honu with a cream color and then adding a slightly darker color like a brownish green color and adding the mid-tone shadows using a darker gray and then adding fine details of the wrinkles using a very sharp pencil. With Prismacolor pencils, fine details are harder to achieve once you have a lot of layers down because they are wax-based and the surface becomes too slick once you have so many layers on. I switched to a polychromos pencil later for fine details in the wrinkles because this is an oil-based pencil and have a harder lead and can layer on top of the wax with no problem. Polychromos pencils are more expensive, so I do not have a ton of colors available. Next, I start to work on the scales of the Honu's fin. I actually used a lot of different methods for scales on this turtle. For the scales on the head, I burnished the base color immediately by pressing the pencil hard into the grooves of the paper right away. Then I added other colors on top. This method worked alright, but because of the wax buildup, it was harder for the different layers of colors to show up. The end result was a less realistic scale in comparison to the other methods I used. What worked best was lightly shading the scales with a base color, in this case a dark gray color, and using different pressure on my pencil depending on the shading or texture of the scale, and then adding more layers of colors on top and burnishing with the top layer colors by pressing hard. Then I go in with an electric eraser to pull highlights and textures and going over the erased parts with various colors. It is also good to add colors from the ocean onto this piece because they do reflect off of the Honu. Moving on to the shell, I lightly outline the plates of the shell with the base color of the grooves that are between each plate. Then I begin to color the shell starting with the dark parts near the neck. I slowly build up layers of color as I move to the top of the shell. The various colors selected offer a good transition of shade. Be sure you are selecting colors that will help you achieve the illusion of depth and dimension. So in this case, the darkest shadows under the shell, I use a dark grape color. Then as I transition to the lighter areas, I use a mixture of browns, greens, reddish browns, and as the shell gets into the light areas, I use different yellows, and I also use a mixture of grays and blues in there. Again, always keeping in mind the textures you are trying to achieve. The shell is a smooth surface, but realistically, there are a lot of blemishes and bumps on there. Always check you're copying your reference photo pretty accurately. Now I'm continuing on with the scales of the fin again, as I got a little sidetracked with the shell. You'll notice I used a pencil eraser to erase some of the scales on the edges of his fin. This wasn't a method I was using, I just realized I had colored too far into the fin where it was supposed to be a lighter peachy yellow color. It worked out though because it created a soft transition. So I just continue on to the rest of the scales and work on the back fin and the front fins using the same method previously mentioned. Also want to point out that I left the parts that are reflecting in the sunlight completely white, so the top of the head, shell, top of the fin, and some other random parts are still white. It might look strange, but will make more sense as the whole piece comes together. I outlined where the edges should be in color that I used for the ocean, just so that I can keep my place when I erase the pencil. This way I don't accidentally color over the parts that should be left white. So here I am working on the under part of the right front fin, again using lots of different colors to create depth, shape, dimension, and realism, and using the pencil eraser to pull highlights and textures. Always be aware of how the pressure of your pencil is affecting the results you're trying to achieve. Also, the sharpness of the pencil makes a difference. Fine point for fine details and a more blunt point, or use the side of your pencil for shading. As you start completing more and more sections of your drawing, you may see that you need to go back and make adjustments. It's good practice to take a step back from your piece and look at how the shades and tones are working together in comparison to the different sections you worked on. You may need to adjust colors or even darken up some areas that appear too bright in contrast to another part. For example, my Honu's neck needed to be darkened a few times as it looked too bright in comparison to some parts of the turtle that were in shadow. Now I start working on the water, starting at the top where the light is reflecting through some waves. First, I erase my pencil markings. You can tell I drew a grid on the paper. I usually use the grid to sketch out my drawing. What you do is draw a grid on your reference photo and then you draw the same grid on your drawing paper. Then using the grid as a map, you map out the drawing onto your paper. It's just a way to break down the drawing into simpler shapes for you to follow, and it also helps maintain proportion and accuracy. So back to the ocean, I started off by using a light sky blue to shade the top of the water, making sure not to color over the white parts as that's supposed to be a light shining through some ripples and waves. Then I used a slightly dark shade of blue around the light areas to create more depth. Then I began with the darkest blue. This is like a greenish blue color, and I pressed hard to shade the whole bottom section of the ocean. I actually was testing out several methods to achieve the look of water and failed at the first attempt. That attempt was to make a gradient look from dark to light by pressing hard with the dark color and then adding the next shade beside it and blending it a little together. This, however, did not work well for me even with using paint thinner, so I ended up coloring over everything in one base color and then blending other colors on top as needed. As I work on the top of the water, I blend out the dark parts with lighter shades. I also burnish the edges of the white sections so they blend more smoothly with the light blue areas, as well as add a slightly darker blue in between to add more depth. I also use a white or sky blue to add tiny water ripples where the water begins to darken, and I use a dark blue to add some shadow ripples as well. The blue polychromos shows up better since the water is pretty waxy at this point. Now I start to add the sun rays shining through the water. I used a ruler to make straight lines where I wanted them. Be sure you're using proper angles, as I messed up mine and it was hard to fix. It's still a bit crooked, but I did the best I could to recover. So pressing really hard, I shade with the white. The white Prismacolor is pretty opaque, but is still hard to achieve the whiteness that I wanted, so I tried using a pencil eraser to pull some color off. It worked okay, but not as well as I wanted. I just kept working at this for a while, and then even used some odorless paint thinner to blend out the strokes and pull off some wax. As you can see, it took a lot of refining and fixing, especially when trying to pull the rays from the white parts of the water, as it just smeared downwards. I would have to erase the smears and constantly fix it. It probably would have been better if the rays were left white to begin with. With the ocean water complete, I can go back and make more touch-ups on my Honu, darkening up various parts as needed. Now I can start on the coral. I work on the coral in the background first. I map out the different coral first, then color in the base colors. I use small circular strokes to replicate the texture of the coral. Since this coral is in the background, I'm not going to worry about too much detail. Also, the color of the coral in the background will look more like the color of the ocean. I add darker shades to draw in the general shapes and shadows of the coral, but again, not trying to make a whole lot of detail. I also used a dark gray color in the very background to draw outlines of more coral. The Prismacolor gray was looking awful at this point because of the wax buildup in the ocean, but the polychromos worked well. I just continue on to the next section of coral, just keeping in mind how close the coral is to the viewer so I know how much color and detail should be showing through. As I say, always check your reference photo. As you get to the coral in the foreground, you will be adding a lot more detail, so build up shapes using various colors and shades of color. Remember, things are never lined with harsh lines. I draw shapes of coral by building up the shadows. even though I'm using a lot of different colored pencils in the coral, it's actually looking a little too uniform. It makes it look really flat. The piece of coral looks like it's photographed in a perfectly lit studio, which is not how it should look. There should be a lot more varying shades and shadow on different parts to make it look more realistic. I should have gone back and did a little bit more touch up on there. I move on to more sections of the coral, and one technique I use for the background coral is making small circles in dark gray and then burnishing over the circles with an ocean color by pressing hard with my pencil. This method works well in getting the out of focus and faded look. You will also notice I am lining the shapes of the coral in the foreground, but I'm not intending to leave it with the harsh line. The color I'm using is the base color, and I will add shadows and highlights to blend out those lines better. I also go in several times with an odorless paint thinner and use a very fine tip round brush to brush onto the inside parts of the coral, and this helps remove the crayon look and burnish the colors better. Drawing all of the coral was pretty tedious and boring for me, so it was really hard to keep going without trying to just rush through it. So you will notice as I get further along, I did get really lazy, especially on the two sections of coral on the right. I began drawing really quick circles all over the place, when really I should have been making the details better, since they are sitting in the front of the viewer. I saw the end in sight and I just wanted to get it done. This was a big mistake and made the piece look awful. It's never a good idea to rush through a piece because it is such a long process and you don't want to throw away all of your hard work and mess up your drawing just because you got lazy in one little section. I went back the next day and looked at it, and I had to redo that section of coral, fixing the details up. If you ever feel like you are getting lazy or tired, it's best to step away, maybe do something else and come back to it later, or maybe take a day or a couple days break from it and then come back to it. Lastly, I do go in and touch up the other coral and add more shadows to make it a little less flat, and then I touch up the turtle in the end as well. Here is the final piece. I hope you found this video helpful. Stay tuned for bonus real-time clips, and don't forget to check out the other videos on my channel. Thanks for watching!